Hi, everybody. How's it going? Good. Awesome. So as Eileen mentioned, I'm Jay Shimshack, and let me give you a brief overview of my work. As usual, she did a better job than I will. But I am interested in public policies for the environment. What works? What doesn't? Why are successful policies working? Why are those that are less successful failing? And what does this mean about designing more effective, more cost-effective, and more equitable policies for the environment? Eileen mentioned several areas of interest. I'm interested in the law and economics of regulation. I'm interested in the tools we use for environmental policy. I'm interested in corporate environmental behavior, why firms make the decisions they make with regards to environmental discharges, and as Eileen mentioned, the benefits and cost of environmental and health policies. Today I want to talk about something I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately, which is environmental inequality and environmental disparities. So, environmental disparities have captured public attention for decades. In 1978, more than 30,000 gallons of PCBs, if you're following the details, polychlorinated biphenyls, these are highly toxic chemicals, were illegally dumped by the Ward Transformer Company of Raleigh, North Carolina, along 210 miles of roads in 14 counties throughout North Carolina. So North Carolina developed a plan to collect these soils that were contaminated by toxic chemicals for landfilling. The landfills were supposed to be located in a county where dumping occurred and isolated from highly populated areas. As I'll tell you more in a minute, two candidate counties very quickly emerged. One was Chatham County and the other was Warren County, North Carolina. The Chatham County site for a landfill was clay-lined, which, by the way, is really good for a landfill. That prevents leaching of toxic chemicals into water tables, etc. It had a relatively deep water table, so where the water lies relative to where the landfill lies is pretty far apart, and this site was publicly owned. Now, the Warren County site had a very shallow water table, which is not favorable for landfills. There's high water well usage, so if there was contamination of well water, it was likely to result in a lot of exposure for local households, and this site was privately owned. Any thoughts on which of these is probably the better choice? Okay. Turns out, however, that there are some other differences between Chatham and Warren County. So Chatham County is roughly 72% white, where Warren County is only 37% white. And in addition, income is very different. So in Warren County, roughly 28% of the county lies below the poverty line, whereas in Chatham County, that's less than 5% of the population. Which site was chosen? The Warren County site was chosen. And in 1982, civil rights activists tried to stop the Warren County landfill project. There were widespread protests, and national media attention followed, and a new social movement was born. That social movement is now frequently called environmental justice, and it is now part of mainstream conversations about environmental quality. So with that as the point of departure, there has now been enormous evidence, which was really kicked off in part by this broad movement, but also a bunch of NGOs, including the United Church of Christ, which issued a study in 1987 that showed that toxic waste sites nationwide have been disproportionately cited in low-income and high-minority areas. Now, I should let you know that toxic siting is now less common and less egregious than in this case from 1978 to the early 1980s. But growing evidence is pretty clear that low-income and high-minority communities are still disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards of many, many different types. Okay, so this is a a map of North Carolina. Again, North Carolina, just because it's anchored to the conversation we just had, is a state I chose. There's no pattern that's particular to North Carolina. This is a general story. But these are emissions from large polluters in 2010. And the size of the site, so each of these circles represents emissions, pollution emissions of toxic and hazardous substances. And the bigger the circle, the more emissions in the year 2010. And that is overlaid on some socio-demographic data, in this case, race data. So areas that are lighter colors, white, light yellow, and orange, are relatively low fraction of white Americans, and redder areas are higher fractions of white Americans. And it seems like just some basic visual inspection across the whole state seems like there's a lot of big circles in the sort of lighter color areas. This is the area, this area has a lot. Why? Does anyone know where this is? This is the Charlotte area. So obviously there's a lot of dense location there, so let's blow that up a little bit. And now let's overlay, instead of socio-demographic data related to race, let's look at income data. Again, the lighter colors are, in this case, lower income data. So white, yellow, and orange are relatively lower income areas, and the darker areas are high income areas. And here you see a very stark pattern. Yes? Following me? Okay. So the basic idea is this is just an example of what appears to be very strong correlations between race and income and the amount of hazardous and toxic waste releases. These disparities are not restricted to the United States alone, and as I mentioned, by no means restricted to North Carolina alone. This is a map of Mexico. The dots on this map represent the 1,600 largest toxic and hazardous waste polluters throughout the country of Mexico for the period of something like 2005 to 2013. The basic idea is how much pollution comes out of these toxic waste sites seems to be enormously related to poverty in the local area. So income data in Mexico is notoriously poor. So what do I mean by a marginalization index? This is an index that sort of captures income and wealth. But the basic idea is poorer areas, bigger numbers, more positive numbers means poorer on average. Poor areas are associated with much higher lead pollution, much higher cadmium pollution, and I could go on with an enormous number of toxic discharges into waterways. I also want to note that disparities are by no means restricted to hazardous and toxic waste. Correlations between income, race, ethnicity, and environmental hazards have been documented for air pollution, for water pollution, for land use, for deforestation, for vulnerability to natural disasters, for the impacts of climate change, and a whole host of environmental hazards. One thing, I hope many of you had a chance to read the pre-read, but one thing that is also important to keep in mind is that these disparities not only exist at any given time, they are remarkably persistent through time. So consider the case of fine particulate matter. PM 2.5 is a type of air pollution that involves very, very, very small particles. If you can't read this, the green area is the width of a human hair. And the white dots along the bottom are the size of PM 2.5. Because they're so small, these particulates easily enter our lungs, our bloodstream, our brains, and they have very pronounced health and consequences for lots of outcomes like human capital accumulation, labor market outcomes later in life, educational performance, etc. But the key point is that this is a common and important pollution that is very important for human health outcomes. So as many of you read, colleagues and I used new data derived from satellites, mostly, but also sort of truthed with ground stations, air quality monitors, and air transport models to identify particulate matter concentrations for basically roughly speaking, every 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid across the entire United States. That results in an individual pollution measure for every one of 8.6 million locations in the United States. We then match those data to a bunch, and I should be clear, for every year for essentially 4 decades, from 1981 to 2016. And then we match that to underlying socio-demographic data. Here is the starting point data in 1981. You can see that the dirtiest parts of the United States were Southern California, Appalachia, and sort of the East Coast, and then the Ohio River Valley. So the good news is that using these data, we first basically corroborated something that we've known for a long time, which is that fine particulate matter and most other air pollutants, other than carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, have been falling. Fine particulate matter air pollution has fallen more than 70% since 1981. So that is a remarkable success story. I had a couple of questions submitted to me in advance. Short answer is it's mostly through regulation. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's the driving force for at least the time period highlighted here. So the solid line in the middle shows the median particulate matter air pollution levels across the entire United States, and you can see that this is falling over time. This is air pollution levels for the dirtiest 90%, sort of the 10% of areas that are dirtiest. This is air pollution at the 10th percentile, the cleanest 10th percentile, and you can also see that both of those are falling, and in more good news, the gap between the dirtiest areas and the cleanest areas is shrinking over time. Still with me? You lying? Okay, good. In other words, absolute disparities fell. But what's interesting is this says very little about what I'm going to call relative disparities, which is we don't know whether the locations that were most polluted historically are still the most polluted, and then I'm going to try to argue after showing you some data that that's a useful thing to have a sense of. Okay. So what do we do in this paper? We measure the persistence of disparities using an area's rank from least to most polluted. So start here at the bottom left of this graph. So at the bottom left, this basically says the 1% most polluted. So the cleanest areas in the United States in 1981 are essentially still the 1% cleanest areas in 2016. Yeah? Let's go over here. Focus on the top right, which I can't reach. A taller person would do better. But the basic idea is the dirtiest areas in the United States, if you're in the dirtiest 1% of a location in the United States, you're still in the dirtiest 1% now. What is remarkable is that that is true essentially at every point along this distribution. For those of you who like math, I'll note that there's a small amount of median reversion, which explains this particular S shape. On the other hand, the basic idea is where you lie in the distribution of pollution is remarkably persistent across time. The cleanest areas in 1981 are the cleanest areas in 2016. The dirtiest areas in 1981 are the dirtiest areas in 2016, and this is true everywhere in between. One thing to keep in mind is that socioeconomically disadvantaged communities are far more likely, as I noted earlier, to lie in that dirtiest fraction of the population. So they are more likely to have higher levels of fine particulate matter in every year since 1981. And to just sort of put that in context, someone living in the most polluted areas of the United States today are exposed to the same level of fine particulate matter as the average American was in 1990. So we've made enormous progress, but The dirtiest areas are still the dirtiest areas. The clean areas are still the cleanest areas. And this has important consequences. So why might it matter? I think it matters for a variety of reasons. First, and a group like this is usually the first thing you think of. It turns out that after you've been brainwashed as an economist for a while, you start to think of other endpoints as well. But fairness, equity, and social justice are inherently comparative. We care at any given point in time about who is advantaged and who is disadvantaged. Then the other thing, just from a strictly policy perspective, federal and state policies require, by law, that different people and different places enjoy the same degree of environmental protection, i.e. no group, regardless of race, et cetera, income, should bear a disproportionate burden from pollution. And a distributive justice notion, federal and state policies require meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to environmental policy. I hope you understand that the data I've just shown you basically tells you that we have done a really great job of reducing conventional air pollution over time, but we've done very little at reducing disparity. Let me just remind you of something that most people take for granted, but disparate or different environmental exposures across subpopulations are expected to be associated with disparate adverse consequences for health, human capital accumulation, and labor market outcomes later in life. When I talk about health, infant mortality is a big one, adult mortality, respiratory conditions like asthma, bronchitis, et cetera, are big things that we focus on with air pollution. When I talk about human capital accumulation, what I mean to suggest is that disruptions caused by pollution, either in terms of biophysical development or directly, seem to have long-term implications for people's educational achievements, test scores on exams, et cetera. That's after controlling for the many things you might expect to be correlated with that. And one thing to note is that this relationship is true both for today's disadvantaged populations, but also for tomorrow's. So to just give you a flavor of that, these are levels of air pollution. This is at the county level. You could also do this at the individual level. These are levels of air pollution for people born in 1981. This is their economic opportunity as adults. I'm happy later to talk about how that's measured, but the basic idea is social mobility and economic opportunity is enormously negatively correlated with pollution at birth. By the way, Jonathan Colmer, who I will cite many papers today from, is a colleague in the economics department here. So you should take a class from him. He's awesome. And Brennan Williams, one of the co-authors on that paper, is a former graduate student of ours. Correlation is not causality. So despite the fact that environmental disparities are an empirical fact, it is very useful from a public policy perspective to take a step back and think, okay, why? You have to understand the underlying mechanisms to understand how to design and implement appropriate public policy solutions. And I'll try to highlight a few of those issues in a minute. I'm sad to report that we actually have very poor information on what the underlying drivers are from a systematic perspective. And to the extent that we know that, we're learning that the answers may be context dependent, which of course makes public policy design particularly challenging at a regional, a national, or international level. So here are some possible mechanisms, which I'll try to explain in a minute. The first is firm siting decisions. By siting, I mean where a firm chooses to locate. Still with me? A few of you are already looking glazed over. 20 minutes in, it's making me nervous. We good? Awesome. So Possible mechanisms that could explain environmental disparities are that firms choose to locate in neighborhoods with lower income individuals or higher minority populations, etc. It may be that the mechanism is bargaining power, political engagement, or institutions. Firms choose to locate, remain, or pollute more in areas where bargaining power and political engagement is low. I'll explain that more in a minute. And then finally, one that is going to require a little more discussion is what economists call amenity-based sorting. Non-economists often call this moving to the nuisance, and it's very closely related to a phrase many of you will have heard, environmental gentrification. So I'll come back to those in a minute and try to explain them. But let's start with firm siting. Where a firm chooses to locate when it first sort of opens its doors to business. So it's possible that a firm chooses to locate in an area with lower income or higher minority populations because the firm owners or operators have some sort of preference to protect white or wealthy individuals for harm. That's absolutely possible. It is also possible, although depressing to think about, that a firm's owners or operators could choose to locate in a specific location due to some sort of malevolent preference to harm other groups. I think much more likely, and certainly in a modern context, firms may choose to locate in areas where there are low income and more minority populations because those things may be highly correlated with local economic conditions, like inexpensive land, or low-wage labor, or access to transportation networks, say major highways. So if you've driven down 81 recently, you'll see a lot of industrial activity in a few places, and you'll see a lot of warehouses, for example. Those are deliberately located to be next to a transportation network. And also, another local condition that may or may not be correlated with race and poverty is government permitting. So that's firm siting. Now let's talk about local bargaining power, political engagement, and institutions. So it may be the case that a firm chooses to stay in a location or pollute more in a location that has lower income individuals or higher minority populations because the residents there may be more likely to accept pollution in exchange for some sort of transfer. Now, often when we think of transfer, we might think of a direct payment. And a lot of you are thinking right now, well, we don't do this. Not true. So oil and gas leasing, for example, and oil and gas installations will actually pay the residents nearby to not only purchase the right, but also manage some of the environmental disamenities. There are other types of transfers that may be important: access to jobs, building parks, etc. Firms may remain or pollute in low-income or high-minority neighborhoods because it's believed the residents may be less informed about environmental hazards or they have less secure property rights. More may be renters rather than owners, and it is well known that renters are much less likely to organize politically, etc. Residents may be less able to mobilize politically due to collective action and public goods challenges. It turns out when a firm is making a decision to locate in one place, there is often one firm, but many people, and sort of coordinating that many people can be really challenging from a public goods or collective action issue. It's also the case that a firm may remain or pollute in a low-income, high-minority neighborhood because a reality or a perception that residents there are less likely or less able to resist pollution via zoning, permitting, political protest, private legal action, you name it. And then one thing that is closely related and has maybe the flavor of this is it may be the case that none of the above is directly true. However, your regulatory authority, whether that be the state or the federal EPA or a regional EPA office, they may choose to monitor, enforce, or remediate pollution issues less aggressively in cases where these things are true. And the evidence does exist that that is true, maybe not on average. And in fact, right now, the EPA uses as part of its targeting strategy environmental justice concerns as an important part of its decision making. So this may have flipped in recent years. Is everybody still following me? Because now we have sort of the hardest one to follow. So you're good. Okay, beautiful. So now I want to talk about this sorting or coming to the nuisance. Some colleagues of mine who are brilliant writers and communicators explain this so well that I thought I'd be better served by just taking their language and the way they frame it than trying to do it myself. So I've cited them at the bottom. I'm often quoting them directly. But the easiest way to think about sorting, which we often call amenity-based sorting or coming to the nuisance, is consider a pair of communities that are basically right next to each other. They have different levels of environmental quality, and for the purposes of what we're talking about now, one is clean, one is dirty. Now, a high-income household would prefer the area with higher environmental quality. You following me? Better air quality, more parks, cleaner water. Everybody's cool with that? Okay. When high-income households move into neighborhoods, what happens to prices? Now, it is evident at face value that a lower-income household might also prefer, in expectation, would prefer the higher environmental quality neighborhood as well. However, that household may not be willing to pay the higher price, preferring to prioritize other necessities like food, clothing, etc. So what is happening? Households sort by income across levels of environmental quality. So poorer households end up in more polluted areas, just as they obtain less of many other things that money can buy. It is very commonly the case that if there is a long history of an industrial facility located in one area, a lot of wealthier people move away. That depresses housing prices, and a lot of lower income people over time move in. If at the moment I were to look for a correlation between income, race, and the location of toxic sites, I would see a very strong correlation, and that correlation may not have existed when that firm set up shop in the first place. It's just that these patterns of amenity-based sorting played out over time. That explains the contemporaneous correlations. One additional thing is once this initial sorting occurs so that poorer households end up in more polluted areas and wealthier households end up in less polluted areas, wealthier households may actually create different neighborhood amenities over time. This paper actually references, somewhat snarkily, a bunch of Starbucks in the neighborhood. And so, but what you can see is different retail outlets, a bunch of different things, higher quality schools start to emerge, and this gentrification, originally driven by differences in environmental quality, have multiplying effects in terms of these patterns. So why am I taking the time in my limited 35 minutes of talking with you before I open it up to questions to highlight these different mechanisms? And the reason is it really matters for public policy. So despite what I just said, let me start with what is often called a no-brainer, which is regardless of how disparities arise, one policy solution might aim to enhance procedural justice, i.e. supporting local community voices directly in environmental decision-making. You can think of lots of ways to go about that. However, to the extent that disparities may be predominantly caused by bargaining power and political influence, you might focus your policy on legal assistance or information disclosure about the harms associated with pollution and how much pollution is in your local neighborhood. Still with me? To the extent that disparities might be caused by where firms choose to locate in the first place, Here, this one's easy. Just simply reducing pollution across the board will reduce environmental disparities. In many ways, this reinforces each other. However, to the extent that disparities are caused by sorting or moving to the nuisance, a somewhat perverse possible outcome is that pollution cleanup in the most polluted areas can actually make disadvantaged households worse off. So let me just pause there and let that sink in for a minute. If we clean up an area, that may raise rents and housing prices, although those housing price benefits are likely restricted to a very small number of owners. It may raise energy prices. It may raise other costs of living. And the median household in those neighborhoods may actually be worse off or forced out. You following that argument? So what is the solution when sorting is the underlying issue? Addressing income inequality. And I am not in any way going to claim that I have a magic bullet for that one. This is challenging. I think many of you know through taxes and transfer policies, lots of other things. There are opportunities. But it's important to remember that the empirical evidence supporting environmental disparities is stark. It is enormously widespread. But it can be caused by different things, and those different things motivate very different policy interventions, or at least policy interventions that have very different bang per buck. If you're interested in the income inequality question, this is a super paper. I've referenced this paper above many times. If you're interested in this topic, please, please, please have a look at that absolutely brilliant paper. And another earlier paper that is really well written from a broader disciplinary perspective. This Mohai, Pello, and Roberts paper is also very compelling. So I aimed for 35 minutes. It is 4:35. It's as if I've done this